They say losing a husband is the hardest grief a woman can bear. But no one warned me that my own son would twist that grief into a weapon right there in the lawyer's office. The room smelled faintly of old leather and polished wood, the kind of office that seemed designed to make you feel small no matter how much life you'd lived. Heavy curtains muted the daylight, leaving the space awash in a soft, amber glow from the chandelier above. My hands rested on my lap, fingers tightening around the strap of my handbag, as though the worn leather could anchor me in a world that had just shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't new to loss. In fact, I thought I understood it well. The man I had loved for over 50 years, my partner in business, in family, in every hardship and triumph, had just been buried 2 weeks ago. The grief of his absence clung to me like a second skin. I could still hear his voice when I closed my eyes, still feel the quiet squeeze of his hand whenever I was uncertain. But nothing prepared me for the cruelty of the words my only son had just hissed across the polished mahogany desk. "Don't expect a dime, Mom. You've had your time." He didn't even bother to lower his voice. The words were pitched just loud enough that the lawyer, busy arranging his files, would hear them too. It was as though my son wanted witnesses to my humiliation. The sting was immediate, sharp, and more devastating than I would have believed possible. I had always feared being alone after my husband's death, but I had imagined my son would be the one tether holding me upright, the one who would remind me that I still belonged. Instead, in those 7 words, he severed that bond completely. I stole a glance at him. He sat arrogantly in his chair, shoulders squared, chin tilted up, as though the outcome of this meeting was already set in stone. His suit was pressed perfectly, his tie a deep burgundy that screamed of wealth and entitlement. The faint curl of a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, the smirk of a man who thought he had already won. I remembered that smile from years ago when he was a boy who just scored a winning goal at a school soccer game. Back then, it was the smile of innocent pride, the kind that made a mother's heart swell. Now, it was something else entirely, a twisted echo of what once was sharpened into arrogance, hardened by greed. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to bring order back to the room. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled the neatly stacked documents before him, and gave me a polite, measured look, as though to remind me that proceedings of this kind demanded composure. But composure was a luxury I felt slipping away. I wasn't just mourning my husband's passing anymore. I was mourning the son I thought I knew. The grief doubled in weight, pressing against my chest until I thought I might not breathe at all. Still, I straightened in my chair. My husband used to tell me, "Maggie, when life knocks you down, don't let anyone see you crawl. Sit up tall, even if your knees are shaking." My knees were shaking then, trembling under the table, but I lifted my chin, folded my hands, and stared at the edge of the desk as though it were the battlefield it had become. The room itself seemed to understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. The chandelier lights hummed softly, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, and the silence grew heavy. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a test of loyalty, respect, and truth. I studied the lawyer's hands as they moved across the documents, long fingers methodical and steady. Papers slid across the desk, pens were lined up neatly beside them. It all seemed routine, mechanical, yet behind that routine lay the future of everything my husband and I had built. My husband's legacy wasn't just numbers on a page. It was nights spent stocking shelves when the store couldn't afford extra staff. It was the calluses on his hands from lifting crates of produce, the dark circles under his eyes from balancing ledgers at midnight. It was the laughter we shared when we finally had enough to take a week-long vacation, the tears we shed when we nearly lost it all during a recession, and the relief when we made it through. That $77 million estate wasn't luck. It wasn't handed down by some distant benefactor. It was carved from sweat, sacrifice, and an unyielding partnership between two people who refused to give up. And now, the man we had raised to understand that legacy sat beside me, dismissing it all with one cruel whisper. I could feel the lawyer's eyes flicker between us. He wasn't blind. He had caught the venom in my son's words. But he said nothing, simply clearing his throat again and adjusting the spectacles on his nose. In that moment, I realized something important. This meeting was no longer just about inheritance. It was about dignity. My son had thrown down a gauntlet, and whether I wanted it or not, I was being pulled into a battle I never expected to fight. I looked at him again, really looked, and for the first time in my life, I saw not the boy I had raised, not the man I had hoped he would become, but a stranger wearing my son's face. His smirk was wider now, as though he thought silence meant defeat. But he didn't know me as well as he thought. He didn't know the steel my husband had seen in me from the very beginning, the quiet strength I had carried through decades of storms. The lawyer placed the top sheet squarely on the desk and smoothed it with his palm. The faint scratching of paper against wood filled the silence like a drum roll. He adjusted his glasses once more and said, "Let us begin." And with that, the true battle for my husband's estate and for the soul of my family began. The lawyer's voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as he began the formal introduction of the will. His tone carried no emotion, no tremor, as if he were reading an instruction manual instead of the final words of a man whose life had stretched across decades of grit and sacrifice. But even as he spoke, my mind was already elsewhere, drifting backward to the beginning. Because if I wanted to survive what was coming, I needed to remind myself of where it all started, where we had started. In 1968, my husband and I were little more than dreamers with empty pockets. He was a man with big ideas but no connections, and I was a woman stubborn enough to believe that those ideas could actually take root. We had scraped together every cent we could, borrowing money from relatives, taking small loans from skeptical banks, and even pawning a few heirlooms that had been in my family for generations. All of it went into one thing: a grocery store no bigger than a double-car garage. The paint on the walls peeled within months. The coolers broke down in the summer heat, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. But that grocery store was ours. My husband stocked shelves until his fingers blistered, while I kept the books by candlelight when the electricity got cut off because we couldn't pay the bill on time. There were nights when I would find him asleep at the kitchen table, his head resting on stacks of unpaid invoices, the faint smell of pencil lead clinging to his hair. And there were mornings when I would rise before dawn to bake bread and make sandwiches, selling them out of the store to the construction workers who passed by on their way to the job site. Every dollar we made went right back into keeping the lights on. Little by little, penny by penny, the store grew. My husband had a knack for people. He remembered every customer's name, every child's birthday, and every family's struggles. If someone couldn't afford milk one week, he'd write it in the ledger as pending and wave them out the door with a smile. He believed that loyalty was worth more than profit, and eventually that loyalty brought us more business than any advertisement ever could. I often wonder if our son remembers those days, the smell of fresh produce, the sound of the bell over the shop door, the way his father would kneel down to his level and say, "This, son, is what honest work looks like." At the time, our boy's eyes would widen, and he would nod with a seriousness far beyond his years. But as the years passed and the store became a chain, things changed. We bought nicer clothes, drove better cars, and eventually moved into a house that seemed far too large for just 3 people. By then, our son had grown accustomed to comfort. Private schools, trips abroad, a car for his 16th birthday. We gave him everything we had once only dreamed of. I thought we were giving him the childhood we never had. Instead, we were teaching him that success was something to be handed over, not earned. By the time we had 20 supermarkets scattered across the state, I could see it clearly. The humility we had once nurtured in him had withered, replaced by a hunger for more. He stopped asking about the business and started asking only about the numbers. "How much did we make this quarter?" he'd ask, leaning back in his chair with a glass of something expensive in his hand. "When do I get my share?" It broke my husband's heart. He tried time and again to bring our son back into the fold. He invited him to board meetings, encouraged him to shadow the managers, even asked him to help with community events where the company donated food to families in need. But each time, our son brushed it off, claiming he was too busy or that such tasks were beneath him. So when I sat in that lawyer's office, clutching my handbag like it was the last piece of myself I could hold on to, it wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about the story of who we were and what we had built. Every dollar in those accounts represented hours of labor, tears shed in the dark, and sacrifices most people would never see. And now, my own child wanted to erase me from that story. To him, I was just an obstacle, a signature on a page standing between him and a fortune he believed he deserved by birthright. The lawyer cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. His eyes flicked briefly toward me, then toward my son, before settling back on the paper in front of him. Harold Thompson, being of sound mind, he began. The words rang out formal, expected, the kind of preamble every will contained. But I sat frozen because I knew my husband too well. He had spent the last years of his life carefully considering what would happen when he was gone. And Harold Thompson was not a man to waste words. If there was one thing I was certain of, it was that the document before us would hold more than simple instructions. My husband had always believed in lessons, in teaching, even when the lessons were painful. As the lawyer's voice carried across the room, smooth and deliberate, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My son leaned back in his chair, smug once again, convinced he already knew what would follow. But I had lived beside Harold Thompson for more than 5 decades. I had seen the quiet calculations behind his eyes, the foresight that had saved our business more times than I could count, and I knew deep in my bones that the words about to be read would not be what anyone in that room expected. The lawyer's voice carried through the heavy air of the office, each word striking like a gavel. His tone was practiced, steady, but I could sense the weight he felt in delivering the message my husband had left behind. He began with the history. "There are 3 versions of this will," he said, looking over the rim of his glasses. "The first, written more than 15 years ago, leaves the entirety of the estate to Margaret." His gaze flickered toward me, respectful but professional, before returning to the text. My son shifted in his chair, his smirk widening again. He leaned back, as though indulging in some private joke. "Ancient history," he muttered under his breath, dismissing the words as irrelevant. The lawyer continued. "The second draft, written 7 years ago, divides the estate equally between Margaret and her son." This time, my son leaned forward, his posture straightening as though this version confirmed what he already expected. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, the beginnings of triumph already lighting his face. I could see the calculations playing out in his head, the vacations, the cars, the investments, the life of luxury he believed was moments away from being secured. But the lawyer did not stop. He carefully turned the page, his expression tightening ever so slightly, as though bracing himself for impact. "The third draft," he said slowly, "was written and signed just 6 months ago. And this one carries conditions." I felt my breath hitch. My son froze mid-tap, his smirk faltering, the confidence draining ever so slightly from his eyes. The lawyer read, his voice crisp and unwavering. "To my beloved wife, Margaret, You are to remain the guardian of our legacy until you see fit to pass it on. If at any point you are made to feel unwanted, disrespected, or excluded by our son, the full estate shall remain solely in your care." The room fell into a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. I could hear nothing but the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second punctuating the shock settling into the air. I glanced at my son. The smug curve of his lips had vanished. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and a flush crept up his neck, staining his cheeks crimson. The reality of my husband's words hit him like a wave. He was not guaranteed anything. "This is ridiculous." He spat suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice cracked with anger, louder than before. He was confused in his final years. He didn't mean that. But I knew my husband. Confused? Hardly. Harold Thompson had been sharper at 80 than many men were at 50. He had seen through balance sheets like they were children's puzzles. He had remembered names, numbers, and even jokes from decades past. If anything, his mind had grown keener in those final years, honed by the awareness of time slipping away. And he had seen our son's arrogance. He had seen the greed hidden behind polite smiles at family dinners, the dismissive tone he used when he thought I wasn't listening, the cold impatience whenever sacrifice or humility was mentioned. Harold had noticed, and he had acted. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling against the edge of my handbag. "Which version is valid?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing in my chest. The lawyer looked directly at me. "The most recent," he replied, "and it was signed 6 months ago in the presence of 2 witnesses. All proper, all legal." The words rang through the air like a verdict. My son's face contorted with fury. His hands, which had moments earlier been drumming with confidence, now curled into fists. His voice came sharp, venomous, cutting across the room. "You planned this. You manipulated him." The accusation struck me like a slap. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. Manipulated him? I thought of the man I had stood beside for 53 years. The man who had worked himself ragged to build the empire our son now treated like his birthright. The man who had whispered to me in hospital rooms, in bank offices, in late-night kitchens, always asking, "Do you think this is the right choice?" He had trusted me. Yes. He had loved me. Yes. But manipulated him? Never. I drew in a slow breath, forcing my hands to unclench. My voice, though quiet, cut through the air like glass. "Your father was not a man who could be manipulated. You know that as well as I do." My son slammed his hand against the desk, rattling the pens and startling even the lawyer. "Convenient," he snapped. "Very convenient that the last will leave everything in your hands." "Convenient," I repeated softly, almost to myself. "No, not convenient. Painful. Necessary." My husband had known his son well enough to see the truth. The lawyer intervened, his tone still formal, but carrying a sharper edge now. "Mr. Thompson, your father's wishes are clear. Unless you have evidence to prove otherwise, the conditions stand. The estate remains in your mother's care." The flush on my son's face deepened. He turned toward me, his eyes dark, narrowed into slits. For a moment, I saw not the man I had raised, but a stranger who looked at me not with love, but with hatred. "You'll regret this," he said, his words low but dripping with venom. "You've made yourself my enemy." A chill ran through me, but even as fear prickled at the edges of my resolve, I felt my husband's presence beside me, as though he were whispering, "Stand tall, Maggie, don't crawl." I straightened in my chair, the trembling in my hands subsiding. My son's rage had stripped away the last veil of doubt. Harold had been right to set conditions. He had known this confrontation would come, and he had given me the shield to withstand it. And though I didn't yet know how this battle would end, I knew one thing for certain. This was not just about money. This was about the soul of our family. And I was not going to surrender. I had carried that letter in my handbag for months, its weight heavier than any purse could bear. Harold had handed it to me one evening as we sat in the sunroom, the glow of twilight softening the deep lines on his face. "Keep this," he told me, his voice quiet but firm. "If there ever comes a day when our son doubts you, when he tries to push you aside, show them this. Let it be my final word." At the time, I brushed it off, insisting that such a day would never come. "He's our son, Harold. He may be selfish, but he's not cruel." But Harold had only given me that look, the one that meant he saw a truth I wasn't ready to face. And now, in the suffocating silence of the lawyer's office, with my son's accusations still hanging like smoke in the air, I knew why he had made me promise to keep it close. With trembling hands, I reached into my bag and pulled out the letter. The envelope was creased at the edges, softened from the times I had held it in moments of doubt. Across the front, in Harold's unmistakable script, were the words, "For Margaret, to be read if they ever doubt you." I placed it on the desk. The lawyer's brows knit together as he picked it up with deliberate care, as though the paper itself carried the same gravity as the fortune we were discussing. He unfolded it slowly, the soft crack of paper filling the silence. The moment felt sacred, as though Harold himself were stepping into the room again, pulling up a chair beside me. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice lower now, reverent, and then he read, "Son, if you are in the room hearing this, it means I feared exactly what I dreaded most, that my success gave you greed instead of gratitude. I leave everything in your mother's care until she decides you are ready. If that day never comes, so be it. She built this with me. She will decide its future." The words lingered in the air, each one striking with the force of a hammer. The lawyer's voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the emotion he usually kept hidden. He folded the letter again with slow precision, as though giving Harold's words their due respect, and then laid it gently back on the desk. I kept my eyes on my son. I wanted to see his reaction, to watch the truth settle in his chest. At first, he said nothing. His eyes darted back and forth, as if searching the room for an ally, for someone, anyone, who would deny what he had just heard. He glanced at the lawyer, but the man's face was solemn, unyielding. He looked at me, but I met his gaze without flinching. For the first time, I did not see my child. I saw a man exposed, stripped of excuses, confronted with the mirror of his own entitlement. The silence stretched, heavy and unforgiving. And in that silence, something shifted inside me. For weeks, I had been afraid of losing him, of the cold distance that might grow between us, of the son I might no longer recognize. But in that moment, I realized something more dangerous. If I continued to stay silent, if I let him trample over the truth of what Harold and I had built, then I would lose myself. I could almost hear Harold whispering beside me, "Stand tall, Maggie." So I did. I straightened my back, pressed my trembling hands against the desk, and locked eyes with my son. "You told me not to expect a dime," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded so hard it shook my ribs. "Well, you were right. You won't be getting one." The words cut through the room like a blade. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His face twisted, torn between fury and disbelief, like a child denied a toy he thought was already his. He slammed his hand down on the armrest of his chair, the thud echoing through the office, but still he found no words to refute mine. For years, I had been the quiet one, the peacemaker, the woman who smoothed over rough edges and made excuses for sharp tongues. But Harold had trusted me with more than just his love. He had trusted me with his legacy, and I would not betray that trust by cowering now. The lawyer shifted slightly in his seat, clearing his throat again, but his eyes met mine with something unspoken, approval perhaps, or respect. He had seen this play out before, in other families torn apart by money. But he knew, as I knew, that this was not just about dollars or assets. This was about a wife honoring her husband's final wishes, about a mother refusing to be erased from the story she had lived and bled for. My son sat rigid, his face flushed, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You'll regret this," he said, venom dripping from every word. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I met his threat with silence. Not fear, not retreat, just silence. Because Harold's words had given me all the strength I needed. If this was a battle, then so be it. But I was no longer fighting to keep him happy or to preserve some fragile image of family unity. I was fighting to protect the life Harold and I had built, brick by brick, from being consumed by greed. The letter sat between us on the desk, its folded edges glowing faintly in the lamplight. It was more than paper now. It was proof. It was protection. It was Harold's voice, speaking louder in death than he ever had in life. And I understood, with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, I wasn't standing alone. The sound of his footsteps lingered long after he had stormed out, echoing down the marble hallway like a bitter drumbeat of finality. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him with a thud, and then there was silence. A silence so complete it felt almost sacred, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I sat still in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My son's anger still hung in the air like smoke, but for the first time in weeks, maybe even years, I felt calm. Not numb, not broken. Calm. It was a strange sort of peace, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and left everything bare. I realized then that the years I had spent quietly carrying this family's legacy, working alongside Harold, supporting him, enduring the sacrifices that had built our fortune, had all been preparing me for this single moment of clarity. The moment I had to decide whether I would continue living in fear of losing my son or stand firm and protect the legacy Harold and I had created. The lawyer cleared his throat gently, bringing me back to the present. He slid the stack of finalized papers across the desk, his expression softer, now, almost paternal. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "all that's left is your signature." The pen felt heavier than it should have as I picked it up. My hand hovered for just a second, trembling slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of what I was about to do. And then I signed, line after line, page after page. With each stroke of ink, I felt a piece of Harold's trust settle onto my shoulders, like a mantle I had been destined to wear. His words echoed in my mind. "She built this with me. She will decide its future." By the time I set the pen down, my trembling had stopped. The lawyer gathered the documents carefully, stacking them with the precision of a man who understood their significance. Then he looked at me, his voice quiet but firm. "Your husband trusted you completely, and now the law affirms it. The estate is yours, and yours alone, unless you choose otherwise." I nodded, absorbing the truth of it, not with glee, not with triumph, but with something deeper, responsibility. Harold had not handed me a fortune. He had handed me the duty to protect the story of our lives. I rose slowly from the chair, smoothing the folds of my dress. My reflection caught in the glass of a framed certificate on the wall. A woman no longer defined solely as a widow, no longer diminished by her son's dismissal. I didn't look like someone who had just lost. I looked like someone who had remembered her worth. When I stepped out of that office, the marble floor beneath me gleamed in the late afternoon light. I walked past the hallway where my son's angry footsteps had faded into nothing, and I didn't chase after him. Not this time. For once, I let him go. Outside, the sun was dipping low, bathing the city streets in gold. The air smelled of rain on concrete, sharp and clean, as if the world itself had been washed new. I paused for a moment, breathing it in, letting it fill the hollow places inside me that grief and betrayal had carved. I realized then that I was not walking away as a widow abandoned by her son. I was walking away as the keeper of our legacy, the one Harold had entrusted to me, the one I had helped build with every ounce of strength I possessed. And more importantly, I was walking away with something I had almost forgotten I had, the strength to decide. Who would inherit this fortune? Who would honor it, respect it, continue it? Those choices now rested with me. No longer was I at the mercy of entitlement, no longer diminished by words like, "Don't expect a dime." I was the one who would decide whether my son could ever earn back his place, and whether others, perhaps those who understood sacrifice and humility, might be worthy instead. I thought of Harold then, his gentle smile, the way his eyes would crinkle when he told me, "Maggie, you've always been the strong one, stronger than even you know." He had seen this moment long before I did, and he had trusted me to rise to it. And I had. As I walked toward my car, the city humming softly around me, I felt the weight of grief ease, just slightly. The wound of losing Harold would never truly heal, but in honoring his final wishes, I carried him with me. He was there in the papers I had signed, in the letter folded neatly back in my bag, and most of all, in the resolve that now steadied my steps. I placed my hand on the car door handle, paused, and looked up at the evening sky. For the first time since Harold's passing, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt expansive, steady, grounded. And to anyone who has ever been dismissed, diminished, or betrayed by the very people meant to love them, I say this: remember, respect cannot be inherited. It cannot be bought, stolen, or demanded. It must be earned through loyalty, humility, and love. My son had chosen arrogance, and for that, he lost what he believed was his by right. But I had chosen strength, and in doing so, I discovered that the greatest inheritance of all was not the fortune on those papers, but the courage to protect what truly mattered. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away, not as a widow, not as a mother abandoned, but as the guardian of a legacy too precious to squander. And for the first time in a long time, I felt Harold's hand in mine. I walked out of that lawyer's office carrying more than signed papers. I carried proof that love, respect, and sacrifice weigh more than any inheritance. Money can build houses, but it cannot build character. My husband knew that. That's why he placed his trust in me, not in entitlement. And now I understand what he wanted me to see all along. Legacies are not about dollars. They're about values. If you're listening to this, let me leave you with something my husband used to say. Respect isn't written into a will. It's written into how you live your life. So to every person who has been dismissed, betrayed, or cast aside by those who should have stood beside them, remember this: you are more powerful than their rejection. Their failure to honor you does not erase your worth. I didn't just leave that office as a widow or as someone's mother. I left as the guardian of a legacy no one could take from me. And you, too, are the guardian of your own story. Protect it. Own it. Pass it on only to those who prove themselves worthy. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them. And if you believe respect should be earned, not inherited, make sure to like and subscribe so we can keep passing these stories forward together.